Hi, welcome to yet another episode of California Society of Anesthesiologists Vital Times of Podcast. This is part 2 of a series on debriefing on the kindness and empathy deficit in the medical profession with Professor Doc Hollan, Dr. Wes Ely, and Dr. David Elkin. We do a deep dive into why it is, sociologically and anthropologically speaking, that the medical profession winds up being one of antagonism rather than one of mutual support, kindness, and empathy. Take a listen.
Well, let's talk about that more because I really think that's an important concept for us to consider. The need for all of us to, in a way, have a pose. And sometimes we make the wrong decision about what persona that should be, somebody who's ultra competent at the risk of sacrificing the empathic parts of us. And the other part that I want all of you to consider is the impact of our modern day need to have a positive profit margin, to have efficiency, to have ever increasing revenue streams, let's face it, and those needs of a hospital as an institution and how that affects the ability of each individual to be empathic, to be kind, and to model.
Yeah, I can comment on these areas. I love, Doug, that you brought up this issue of if we make these mistakes and how are we going to be responded to by our medical community and so forth. And I like to use the power of human story. So another example from just what happened yesterday and this morning with me was that we had, and I'm going to focus on the interactions between our team members. So this is about empathy within the team. We had this very difficult situation with a patient, and I won't reveal any particular patient identifiers here, but this patient wanted to be a full code, but he was dying imminently of a bunch of untreatable problems. And all of us were very, very afraid that we would make the wrong decisions surrounding his medical care. And overnight, the residents were confronted with exactly their worst nightmare. And this patient had a bunch of crazy things happen. And this morning he died. And so on rounds with this patient having died on the other side of the door outside the room, we sat there. And after we went to the bedside, we had what we could refer to as the pause, which was started by a nurse in Virginia and then propagated by Sylvia Perez Proto at Cleveland Clinic. And now there's people all over the country doing the pause to take 30 seconds to a couple of minutes at the bedside to remember this person, lift them up in their dignity, and as a team to let each person bring to the situation what they want to bring in terms of silent thoughts, etc. After we did the pause, we then went outside the room and we asked each other, how are you struggling? What is going on in your mind right now that we should talk about as a team? And let's be there for one another so that we can discuss this hard part of our vocation and not just pretend it didn't happen and carry it around internally. And to make a long story short, what happened was a couple of residents expressed their thoughts. One started crying. One had to leave the room. I went off and gathered with that person and then came back together. But there was this very powerful experience of all of us being vulnerable with one another, humble enough to admit what we didn't know, what we didn't expect to happen for this patient, humble enough also to talk about how we felt moral injury from these difficult decisions that we were forced into making, perhaps in disagreement with the patient. And it was just a very tender time for me as an attending to watch these young physicians open up at the bedside after this very emotional thing. And a lot of it was empathy, compassion for one another. And there was nothing easy about it, my friends. It was a difficult road, but at the end of it, we all knew that extra 30 minutes was right and good, even though it slowed us down on rounds. It had to happen. And I walked in the hospital today having no idea that was going to occur, but I'm so glad it did.
Yeah, this is David. I think examples like that they're so powerful because they show what our systems are capable of if we prioritized caring for each other and knowing that we're the agents that get our patients better, right? We're not widgets. We're not cogs in a machine, which at worst, I think it can feel like, it's like what what are your productivity standards, right? And how do you fit in teaching with that? And how do you fit time in for compassion? And I want to go back to Doug's question also, because I think it's the inverse about, guilt and shame as very powerful levers that are used in some ways to shape not just our performance, but also our values, right? And sometimes that can be used to steer us away from compassion for each other and for others, right? And this idea that we have to be extremely sure of things rather than we have to demonstrate humility, right? And live humility. That we have to stay very narrowly focused rather than being broader. What happens to our curiosity in these settings? Why aren't we more empathic and curious about our patients? And I think we have a lot of justifications, but a lot of times we don't really live it. I can think of examples even early on where I definitely felt guilt and shame around, and this was during medical school. I remember my grandmother dying after a very protracted series of catastrophic medical events, and it was really devastating. It was right before the night before the start of my second year. And instead of being empathic towards me, I remember a couple of faculty members in particular noting that I needed to pull myself together and focus on my studies. I can remember other times making minor but significant errors as a beginning third year medical student. And it was drilled into my head that you just didn't do those things and you were meant to feel guilt and shame. And so I think at a very early stage, you learn to bond to the hierarchy of the team. You learn to not make errors. You learn not to talk about things. But I think it's so important. I want to also just close this comment with one final example. This was about 20 years ago, but one of the medical teams was talking about the significant number of patients they had admitted the night before, and they somehow had to process all of these patients, get through seeing them, talking about them. And then they got news that one of the patients who they had started seeing in the emergency room was not going to come up from the emergency room because they had coded, and emergency medicine team had not been successful in resuscitating them. So they had died. And one of the residents made the comment, "Oh, great. Okay, that's one less patient," as in our patient load just got much less overwhelming and much more manageable. At which point the attending intervened and said, "Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about this. This is someone that we barely met who just died. Let's just talk about what that means for a second." And she was great about slowing things down and getting the team to remember that it wasn't just a checklist on their list that had gotten crossed off, right? It was an actual patient. It was someone's life who had just ended, and thinking about the importance of that. I think that was a really beautiful moment. Rehumanized the team in the face of very human stressors, right? Completely sensing, being overwhelmed and overworked. The attending nonetheless brought them back. And just as Wes did, I think, the check-in, like, how are we doing with this? Let's think about this in a human way. And I think there are those opportunities, but we somehow need to shift the systems to support us in that.
That is such a great example of how important it is to slow down. I was talking to Wes about long COVID in a different podcast, and we started talking about this concept of slow medicine, taking the time to really slow down and think about some of these details that really can alter the entire journey for each part of that care experience. I wanted to pose that to Doug. So, Doug, as an anthropologist, you've heard all of us now talk about these different elements in medicine that make it difficult to pause, to be humble, to take the time to think about each whole person, whether that's a colleague or a healthcare ally or a patient. So what are examples you can think of that societies decide that that's actually something that's necessary, that's beneficial, that's useful? And how do we copy that into medicine to allow that to happen?
Well, thank you. This is Doug again. In answer to that, I'll just go back to one of the points that I made at the beginning, that this virtuous aspect to empathy and compassion is one that is actually stronger in North America and in Europe than in other parts of the world. It's not that people in other parts of the world don't appreciate what we're this virtuous aspect, but in some parts of the world, people are living so close to the edge of subsistence that it's not really something that they can afford to do. It's not something that has been cultivated from a cultural and social point of view. And I would add that, in looking at empathy cross-culturally, many of you have been alluding to the larger social structures in medicine. And compassion and empathy, at least from a cross-cultural point of view, very much emerges within a social, cultural, economic, political, and moral context. And that whole context is very important for whether it's taken seriously or not. So I would just say that we can't presume that empathy is going to be considered a virtue necessarily, given the larger context. And so in order for this to change within medicine, as all of you are pointing out, these examples of the modeling at the bedside, I think, are hugely important. But it also requires this, larger structural change in medical education and the way hospitals are run, I think, in order for people to actually enact that kind of thing on a day-to-day basis. I think it's wonderful that you're giving these beautiful examples of the modeling that can happen despite all of the challenges within a medical context. And several of you have mentioned how this can be contagious. But it led me a while ago to wonder that the opposite is probably true as well. One of the things I'm interested in is within any kind of social or cultural setting, the individual variation that you can find within that setting. And some of you are pointing out how a single individual at a bedside modeling the correct, the empathic compassion, concern for the patient or for their colleagues can make a huge difference. But it made me wonder, all it takes is one bad apple in one of these settings as well to make something very uncomfortable for people. All it takes is, these collections of residents that several of you are talking about at the bedside. All it takes is one sort of judgmental person to kind of disrupt that atmosphere and make it much more difficult for people to interact in a vulnerable way, in a compassionate way with one another. And so it would require things like, for large scale change, I think it would require also dealing not only with these underlying structural factors that could promote empathy, but what are we going to do in situations where someone or something is interfering with our ability? How do we respond to that? Do we just walk away? Do we have mechanisms for trying to confront whatever the disruption is and take care of it? These are complicated questions, I think, that Ludwig is raising right now.
Well, let me push you on that a little bit more, Doug. Thank you for mentioning all that. And I agree with you. I think, especially in this modern medical environment where all of us are pushed to be more productive and to have more throughput. And also there are some very adversarial interactions between different specialties. Somebody wants a patient to get a procedure done sooner. Somebody else wants a patient to leave the emergency room faster, for example, to get to the ward. Everything becomes very transactional. And those metrics, I think, are easier to measure and to sort of expect from a performance perspective by the hospital. So you're totally right about all of that. And I guess what I would love to learn more about is, from your experience studying various societies and various systems, where empathy and kindness have either been deficient or have been reinforced. What are the drivers that make a system or a individual be able to I guess, fight for those values? And is it more dependent on each individual, or is it more dependent on the system recognizing that this is something that's valuable to do?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I think that one of the things especially in the Pacific region that I know most about, that drives a lot of compassion and concern for one another, is the value placed on reciprocity. The social recognition of intersubjectivity and interdependency, the recognition at a very deep level that we all depend on one another. And if we're highly dependent on one another, the person who fails in that regard gets ostracized, often in fairly dramatic ways. You're not participating in our mutual well-being. And if you're not going to do that, hey, don't count on us to help you out in the future. You can't count on us to take care of you if you're not going to try to take care of us. So there are these larger social values that I think will promote what we're talking about here as empathy and compassion. The recognition that we're all highly interdependent. And that's a challenging thing in our own society because we have this myth of individual success, the importance of entrepreneurship, and so on, which is the valorization of the individual and his or her efforts. And so this is a very different kind of model, but I think it's much more successful at promoting the recognition of interdependence and the compassion and empathy that goes along with that. Now, having said that, another of the things I'm interested in is that despite an overall cultural setting, how do specific individuals, how do they react to a setting in either a positive or negative type way? And, I've known individuals, especially within my research in Indonesia, where there is this value on reciprocity and interdependence and compassion for one another. But people who have been injured or wounded in certain kinds of ways find it impossible to engage in that well. They do not have faith any longer that they can be with people and be helped and be understood. In fact, it's the opposite. They feel they're worried and concerned about their interactions with others because they've been injured in a certain kind of way. And I think that happens in any cultural context. People can be injured in such a way that they become very wary of their interactions with others. On the other hand, I'm thinking in particular of a specific person in Toraja that I knew very, very well, who, because he had suffered through a lot of hardships in his life, was even more empathic and more compassionate than the cultural context would suggest or warrant. And so I think both things are important, Ludwig. I think the social context is really important in terms of turning compassion and empathy into a virtue that all of us want to engage in. That's really important and significant. And if you don't have that, it's hard to practice on an individual level. But I'm really struck with these examples of modeling that our colleagues here have given us, because no matter what the social context is, if someone is brave enough and strong enough to model the right kind of behavior, you never really know where that's going to lead.
I like that a lot. David, do you have any thoughts about what we've been discussing?
I think that Doug's points are so important because it's about the culture, right, that we find ourselves in. Where does that culture come from? There are obviously broader cultural factors within our society, right? I mean, it's hard for us to see those things, just like the one fish that calls out to the other fish, "How's the water today?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" Right? Because we take it for granted. It's all around us. But I think, we're so used to thinking about the importance of, reducing hospital costs and increasing patient flow, We forget that we're working in a system where healthcare is, not necessarily a right. I personally, that's one of the reasons I really like working in public health, because I feel like the values align more with my own, but that's not an answer for everybody. A lot of people work in hospitals that are a combination of private and public, and profit and cost motive does factor in. A lot of the problems we're talking about, while they couldn't be solved completely, could be greatly ameliorated by throwing more money at the problem, right? If we hired more people and made people's positions less overwhelming, that would really help. Unlike in my day where we were working 90 to 100 hours a week during my internship in medicine, there are now 80-hour-a-week restrictions in place. But if you go to Europe, they think that that's a completely unrealistic, almost insane notion that people can somehow work 80 hours a week. So I think we're modeling early on that people's time isn't really valued and that they're going to get burned out and exhausted, but just wait for your vacation and recharge and then get back to work. And I think that's the setting in which we find ourselves. So I think to an extent, we have to look at the systems that surround us. And I think even within those systems, the leadership can identify empathy and being kind and being professional to one another as an important value. Sometimes I know at our hospital, it seems kind of cheesy perhaps, but there are awards for professionalism, treating other people in other professions well, as it should be. I don't think it should be a specific award for that necessarily, but I think it would be nice if we could spread that model to that's just the way we're treating each other. And I think some systems, they do pay attention to this. I know within the Kaiser system, they look at, did you feel heard today? What was your level of satisfaction with the provider, the nurse practitioner, or the doctor who saw you? And I try to fill those things out fairly seriously when I'm on the patient side of things, because I do think it's really important. And I've had the luck of having been seen by some really great providers, nurse practitioners and nurses and doctors that within my private healthcare insurance plan, but also at UCSF. And I think the ones that stand out are the people that are incredibly kind and incredibly competent. And they had the time somehow to spend that with me. And I feel incredibly grateful, but I think that we need to support that. So maybe that means that some of us listening to this show today will have more of an interest in going into administration and taking up the mantle of leadership and trying to really identify these as important issues. That it's not just hewing to the bottom line, saving the hospital money, being financially efficient, but it's also about providing care that is compassionate and empathic. And that has to start with the way we treat each other. I think the inverse of that is our feeling guilt and shame within these systems, and then we're not comfortable within ourselves, and then that spreads to our treatment of others, and that trickles down to the patients and their families.
Well, I wanted to explore that just a little bit more because I feel like, this is a California Society of Anesthesiologists podcast. And if I can stereotype and generalize anesthesiologists, we tend to be very proactive and doers. We like to have action steps that we can take to, help ourselves and help our patients. And what I've heard thus far in this discussion is that empathy is something that is a product of both a group societal type of behavior and expectation, but also very much comes from self-motivation. So we can each do that, but we also need to have our entity. So in that case, our hospital, our institution, our department have that value, have empathy as a priority. So how do we go about asking for that? Or do we do that? An earlier podcast for the CSA was about improving workplace culture. And I am a little bit stunned to think that all of these things actually converge. So one of the concepts we talked about in that discussion in terms of improving workplace culture is that the advocates, the leaders for wellness need to be action heroes. They need to go, for example, to the institution and demand for certain things. So, for example, do we go to our hospital and demand as one of the mission statements that we need to place as a priority, empathy toward each other? What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say that, your comment makes me think of the system-wide strike within the UC system for TAs, teaching assistantships, and postdocs that happened back in the late fall and winter here in California. I think no doubt you have heard about that. And it was, it was a very, very important movement. Everyone has known for years and years and years that we could not run the University of California without these teaching assistants. We want them to be empathic and compassionate with our students, and yet we were asking them to live on wages which could not support a decent lifestyle for themselves here in California. And their power came from their organizational efforts and their solidarity with one another. They felt compassion and empathy for one another. They banded together and they went to the UC system and said, something has to be done. Something has to change. And so my quick thought is that it's likely going to have to take something like that for physicians to change their world enough for them to enact some of these compassionate behaviors with one another on a daily basis. Because the counter pressures for profit and for productivity are just so strong that from an individual point of view, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be really, really challenging. But maybe the path forward is more organizational efforts among yourselves.
Yeah, this is David. I like that idea a lot. I think what we're saying is, if this is really important to us, not just for us, but for our colleagues and our patients, then we should be organizing. We should be advocating. We should be becoming effective, not just safety, but power in numbers, right? We should be bringing this to the administration of the organizations that we're in, the systems that we're in, and asking or demanding change, right? We should be undertaking studies that show that when things are changed, and that could be something as small as a pilot project, but that it aligns with the goals that many of the institutions will talk about, right? Many leaders will talk about the importance of workplace culture, the importance of workplace safety, right, for patients, that we want good, effective care, that we want it to be efficient, that we want it to be cost effective. And I think we can show that empathy and kindness can easily align with those and actually be synergistic with them. It's not an either or proposition. But the catch-22 there is it takes time for us to come up with that energy that we need for organizing and studying the problem. Where do we get that?
It's a call to action. Well, let me start to wrap this up. And I wanted to ask both of you what else you really want to communicate to our audience about this discussion of the kindness and empathy deficit within medicine, and to have people think about that some more.
Well, I'll jump in there. This is Doug. And just say what I would underscore is the fragility of empathy. I mean, we often think of it as this, this very basic core sort of biological attribute that people have potentially, but in a social context, I think our discussion is underscoring just how fragile it can be, even when someone wants to be very compassionate and empathic with other people. If the obstacles to that are too strong, their efforts are going to be broken down. They're going to get discouraged. They're going to give up on it. This is something that requires work and effort and time. The other thing that I would underscore, and here I'll bring in my psychoanalytic background, that in that context, you have the luxury, and it's truly a luxury compared to what we're talking about today, to sit with someone and talk to them about their most serious concerns and worries in life, to try to really get it from their perspective. That takes time. It takes effort. It's not something that happens quickly. As I've mentioned several times, even in a psychotherapeutic context, a lot of people have worries and concerns about the empathizer. Can this person be trusted with my own vulnerability? And so, given all of that fragility and the contingency of these empathic processes, I think it makes it all the more important to think about the obstacles to empathy. And it requires us to really think through what can we do in an active way to promote people's ability to relate to one another in that way.
Interesting. And I think, just to play devil's advocate, I'll supply the other side of the coin, which is the resilience of empathy, and the fact that we have new people entering training in the workplace who seem more empowered and less likely to take no for an answer. And sometimes they're in the best position to remind us clearly of how things look, and that empathy is something that we can grow. Just like a plant that withers, it can be brought back if it's not too late with water. We can restore empathy in these settings, and to the providers, the people that work in them, that we need to somehow get off the merry-go-round of thinking that there just isn't enough time and we'll just buckle down and keep working harder, and that somehow this has to be a priority, and that it's not too late. I think we have to feel that way. And I don't think it's unrealistic, but I agree though, Doug, I do think it's a somewhat perilous time, because I do think within our society and within medicine, we are seeing some of the breakdowns. We're approaching these points where things are getting out of control, and we're suffering for the lack of empathy for each other and compassion for each other. And we see that in the discourse in politics, and even in settings like next door. I was thinking about these social networks that were designed to bring people closer, and instead what they do is they serve to both illustrate and also maybe to magnify the divides between us. And it's really unfortunate. We need to figure out, not just within healthcare, but for the human race, how we're going to surmount that, right? If we're going to all survive the challenges of the mid-21st century. Right? We've got to come together somehow. We have to have empathy for each other. It's critically important, maybe one of the most important things out there. We have to have compassion, and it can't just be feeling for each other. It has to be translated into action. We have to make changes.
Thank you for that, David. I am so grateful, really, to all of you who have had this incredible conversation about this, because I really wanted us to explore this concept of empathy and understand why it's important, how it disappeared, and the details that really sort of explain how it could be brought back and how it can be sustained. And what I hear is that it's a fragile element, but it's so essential. And a lot of us have either openly or not, or subconsciously being impacted by it and impacted adversely. I think our very transactional modern way of doing everything in our lives probably also has impacted the essence of empathy. But that's the flip side of it, is that all of us can contribute to bring it back. We need to be proactive. We need to think about our own ways of providing empathy to each other, but we can also think of ways of organizing and asking and demanding for the time to slow medicine down, to reconfigure our systems so that there is space for empathy, which in the long run will help to sustain us.
Let's end on a hopeful note. I think about Pandora's box, right? The mythology of Pandora's box. Hope was the last thing left. And there are ways of taking that hope and translating into action. People here can go out and, listeners who are hearing this podcast can go out and be empathic and compassionate with their coworkers. Spend 30 seconds asking them how they're doing, right? And stick around for a more serious answer than, oh, fine, things are great, right? Like really, really make inquiries and be curious and find out the stories of the people that you work with and the patients that you're encountering, right? Take the time to ask people about their backgrounds and what their sense of things is. Why do you feel like you're ill today? What's bringing you to the hospital is, not just in a biomedical lens, but also, what's your understanding of what's happening? And don't just cut them off, but really listen to them. I think those are small ways that we can start to change things. And that gives me hope for the future.
I agree. I'm going to thank all of you for participating in this conversation, a very important one. And I hope that all of our listeners have taken something away from this. And like you just pointed out, David, go back to their practices and environments and start making small changes that lead to something more. This is Ludwig Lin, and this concludes another episode of Vital Times, the California Society of Anesthesiologists podcast. Thank you for listening.